Okay, it is June 23rd of 2014. We're going to take a look at Rudolf Bultmann again. We looked at his Kerygma and Myth from 1953. Well, that was made such an impact that he was invited to give the Gifford lectures at Edinburgh University in Great Britain in 1955. And in 1955, the topic of those lectures was history and eschatology. So he took up his phenomenology of Kerygma and Myth and applied it to history. And so essentially, we're looking at an approach to history within the structural confines of a phenomenology, which sounds almost like a contradiction, but you have to understand that for Bultmann, history informs self-understanding, it constitutes the self, and therefore it functions in a very direct, corresponding way to a phenomenology. And so we can look at his view of history within phenomenology. He presents it in that same structure, in that same order. He wants to show its progression up through Greek philosophy until it evolved through early Christianity, and then through more refined Christianity in Paul and John, especially. He prefers Paul and John. But then he'll eventually arrive at his position of how self-understanding is the key to the presentation of the Kerygma, and that we are to articulate the notion of self-understanding in our positing of the notion of Kerygma, of the notion of the true. And to reach that point, we eventually want to reach up through Greek philosophy till we finally reach the Gospel of John, and then interpret the Gospel of John existentially in the same way that he did the crucifixion and the resurrection in his book Kerygma and Myth. So we'll begin by taking a look at the self's current historical situation. He says that the self's condition is one of anxiety. The self is lost in a feeling of anxiety of being at the mercy of the trajectory of history. There's the evidence for the self of the divergence between one's aim and its actual accomplishment. And there is a presence of an objective inner logic that is posited that overrides the will of the self. So there's like this inherent fatal logical necessity that overrides any true freedom of the self. So there's a fear that the consequences of technology and history will reveal frightening possibilities over our initial moral intentions. There's a real chance that this contingency and fatal necessity can bring about frightening possibilities. So he says the true goal of the self is to be a self with the intentionality of establishing some measure of substantiality in this kind of a fatal contingent environment. Self desires to establish some kind of self-substantiality. Now, the self's historical legacy has been Greek tragic fatalism. This created the false notion that the true self was to be reached beyond the world and beyond the world's fixed laws. There's also the idea of Judaic absolute transcendence, which rules history and is beyond human comprehension. These further introduced ideas of the self's impossibility to reach substantiality. And then there was the legalistic ethics of the organized church, where it posited that the self finds freedom in obedience to church dogma. And in the modern era, we've evolved to sociology, where self becomes an object of natural science, centered in that natural science sociology. So there are many reasons for the anxiety of the self. There are many reasons for the disparity between an individual's intentionality, and the contingency that affects that intentionality and brings about frightening possibilities. So the answer that Bultmann wants to seek is to develop an eschatology and a history that can coincide to answer that anxiety and answer the subject's intention to reach substance. And Bultmann begins with deconstruction, and for him that means deconstruction of mythology, of the myth, in order to unveil the true charisma of otherness. And that means we deal first of all with Greek, what he calls logography. He gets that from logos and graphe, logography. And this is the idea that there's a divine influence over history, which is political in nature. It's an immanent force. It's a law that directs history. And cosmic movement is linked to history. Change is changing configuration only. And nature and history are in an analogous relationship. So logography ended up being a preparation for the Christian view of history. It emphasized moral law as that which governs history. And the agency of the self is a self that stands outside of history. So you've got this divinely influenced history, and the self stands outside in opposition to that cosmic event. Now, in contrast to the Greek logography, Bultmann says there was a Judaic historiography. The historiography says that life is communal rather than political. The ordinances are emphasized. There's a history of divine ordinances, of blessings and curses. There's a present teleology, or a plan of God in all of reality. And order is the historical order which is posited as that teleology. Now, this teleology does contain epochs as a series of stages of development of the teleology, the divine teleology. And individuals are called in history to a self-knowledge within this trajectory and horizon of the divine. So responsibility does get posited as a concept. And history is looked at as a sermon to the people, a sermon of the imperatives of the blessings and the curses. So that's the ordinances of the blessings and the curses become fundamental as far as the dialogue that encounters the individual. Now, the promise and its cycle, history is connected through divine promise and through a cycle of judgment, penitence, and forgiveness. Judgment, penitence, and forgiveness. And so a Mosaic base is formed. History is influenced by the prophets. The past is to be critiqued, and there's an exhortation given for the present based on that critique. And history is promissory in nature, and revelation is gradually unfolded, and history passes through the epochs of Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Moses. Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Moses. And that brings Bultmann to his key point at this initial level, that the first realization of eschatology can be understood as the presentation of a triad, and it's a triad of the periodicity of Gnosticism, and then the idea of restoration in Stoicism, and then Gnosticism and Stoicism combine to form the very early eschatology of the early Christianity. But the early Christianity will also complement that synthesis with an additional taking up of the idea of prophecy in the Judaic historiography. So you look at the periodicity of the Gnostics. History conforms to nature's seasons. It has a periodicity of its own. The year of the world is posited. Time is cyclical, and the goal is to return all things to Zeus. So it's a big circle of the return to Zeus. And that the idea of an ekperosis, or a cataclysmic event of fire at the end of this series of periods, results is that transition time when everything makes full cycle back to Zeus. It ends in a cataclysmic fire. Now, there is the idea of new creation, though, because the return in fire to Zeus is followed by the radiating of a new world year. So the end of the first world year, the first year of the world, ends in the cataclysmic fire, but then it is reabsorbed into Zeus and then re-radiated as a new creation and a new world year. And all of this is based on the idea of the essence of elements, the essence of the elements. Now, so that's the idea of periodicity, these evolving periods of the development of an eschatology that will eventually reach a cataclysmic, apocalyptic end and then return to Zeus. Now, the Stoics introduced the idea of restoration and apokatastasis, the return of the cosmos at the end to the world year to begin the new world year. The idea of Virgil is taken up here, the Roman poet. The last period of the old world is already present. Currently, we live in the rule of Apollo. The change of eras is at hand right now, and it will be marked by the birth of a child who will initiate a new human generation, and this will become the time of salvation, opposed to the previous aeon of the time of evil. So it sounds that we're looking at a true forerunner to Christianity here in the ideas from Virgil and the idea of restoration from the Stoics. Now, the first eschatology did take up, the first Christian eschatology that evolved out of this Greek forerunner, did take up the idea of the doctrine of periods. It is taken up. But the cyclical concept of time is rejected, and this is where it is replaced with the Judaic idea of prophecy, and so promise becomes a time category. Epangelia, the Greek epangelia, meaning promise, becomes a time category. So for the early eschatology of Christianity, we live in the realm of promise, an eschatology of promise, but we do believe in this evolving series of periods of the development of the unfolding revelation. So you've got up with a triad, and the triad consists of the periodicity of Gnosticism combined with the idea of restoration and Stoicism, coupled with the ideas from Virgil, combined to form a synthesis of the new eschatology as epangelia in Christianity, an eschatology of promise. So Bultmann takes us from there, and he says that this early figuration of eschatology is taken to the conversation threshold, where the dialogue of extracting the kerygma from myth. Remember, a dialogue is a dialogue we can engage in order to extract the absolute alterity of otherness from its enclosure in mythology. And so they want to extract it from this early figuration of Christianity, which has been influenced by mythology. And Bultmann says he presents this as a triad also. He presents the Jewish apocalyptic, which he says strongly influenced early Christianity. And then that's in opposition to the kerygma of the actual preaching by Jesus of Nazareth. So the opposing poles of the triad are going to be the the mythological Jewish apocalyptic, which is contaminating and enclosing the originary charisma of the proclamation of Jesus of Nazareth. Now he's got 8 points here for the Jewish apocalyptic. It posited the idea of 2 eons. The final judgment is a cataclysmic event. It depicts this process as the birth of a Messiah to the advent of an Antichrist. The Davidic king is replaced by the Son of Man idea. And the old world will be replaced by new creation. It'll be a divine necessity. And welfare and final judgment coincide. And community refers to the elect and not necessarily to the political nation. That's the later Jewish apocalyptic that preceded and influenced the Christian eschatology, the early Christian eschatology. And distinction to that, we have the 7 aspects of the charisma of Jesus of Nazareth. A time of decision has arrived. The attitude toward the person of Jesus is decisive. There's a proclamation that this time is a fulfillment of Old Testament promise. Judgment is always final judgment. Humanity is sinful. Promise is the promise of life, not a cataclysmic event, but a future life. And the metaphor of a banquet is used to depict salvation. And therefore, the end is at hand. This is the time as the consummation of salvation history. We are in the era of a new covenant that establishes our link to Israel, and we are living in the community of the end time. And unfortunately, that Stoicism was present of an ethics of abstinence, which still needed to be overcome. And there is an idea of a history as eschatology. So that counters the Jewish apocalyptic of the later Jewish faith that needs to be stripped away, that mythology that needs to be stripped away. And if we do that in dialogue, we can move on to refining that Christian figuration. And that takes place as in the area of the notion of the true. The early Christian figuration reaches the triad of problem, deconstruction, and resolution. And the resolution takes place in Paul and John. So we're going to pass through problem, deconstruction, and resolution. And resolution will be articulated through Bultmann, through the theology of Paul and the theology of John. Now the problem that the early eschatology of the Christian church ran into was the delay of the parousia. Where was Jesus returning in the clouds? Where was the new kingdom of heaven arrival? Where was this cataclysmic event? The problem for the early eschatology of the church is the delay of the parousia. The imminent end failed to arrive. It failed to arrive. It didn't happen. Because of this, the spirituality of Christianity started evolving into religion. Tradition gained foothold as the foundation of Christian religion, and tradition ended up equaling delivered doctrine, the dogma and doctrine. But the true goal was to reach the word delivered from the beginning, the originary charisma. So the goal of doctrine is to reach the originary charisma, but unfortunately it is enclosed in a dogmatic delivered doctrine. So it created a new problem of its own because of this delay. So you've got an enclosure in dogma, but you've got an intentionality to reach the originary word of charisma. So we have to move on to deconstruction, says Bultmann. That means we have to deconstruct the Gnostic influence. We have to deconstruct the Stoic influence. And we have to extract that originary charisma that we want to rewrite and reshape and posit. We have to extract the elements of charisma. Now the elements of charisma for Paul were threefold: universality, grace, and anthropology. Universality, grace, and anthropology. Universality becomes a concept for Paul. Salvation addresses the history of all mankind, not just Israel. Grace becomes a concept. The end of periodicity, or the end of the first eon, will not be due to the cataclysmic destructive event, but will be due to God's act of grace. And eschatology is tied to anthropology. The cosmic catastrophe that was supposed to reach welfare is replaced by an eschatology of self-identity and self-understanding, which reaches righteousness and freedom. So the eschatological teleology is for self-understanding, for the self to reach righteousness and freedom, true freedom from past entanglements. So we've got the problem of wanting to unveil the true kerygma out of the religion-type dogma that resulted because of the delay of the parousia. The deconstruction revealed universality, grace, and anthropology. And so now we can look to see how this eschatology becomes resolved into a newly shaped posited kerygma. What is the later development in Christian eschatology? How does it escape that early figuration that was contaminated and reach a pure positing of kerygma? And Bultmann says, first, it's through Paul's development of the idea of the historicity of man. The historicity of man is posited. Every situation offers the self a call of God. The self enlists the spiritual listening of hupakuo to listen for the divine call, and self acquires essence through decision and freedom in historical life overcoming the sark's flesh. So you've got real historical dialectical involvement in reaching a new self-understanding of anthropology. Now, Bultmann says the second major influence is John's Gospel, which presents the crucifixion and the resurrection as existential. John's Gospel presents the crucifixion and the resurrection as existential. And we know this is key for Bultmann because we found this in his book on kerygma and myth. But krisis, for John, is judgment that happens to the self in the hearing of the word of Jesus, not final judgment. Judgment happens in hearing the word. Hearing the kerygma creates a judgment, an interrogation. And pistis, or the faith, in response, when the self makes the response of faith, the self has already passed through the final judgment. Self already passes through judgment in the act of faith, so the interrogating krisis of proclamation coupled with the response of faith constitutes both sides of judgment. And eschatology refers not to a cataclysmic event, but simply to the individual's life after the individual completes the earthly life. So it just addresses life after one passes away. So it's an existential interpretation of crucifixion that, incidentally for John, just like Bultmann said in Kerygma and Myth, it already contains within itself its own exaltation. The resurrection qualifies the crucifixion, but the crucifixion in itself is all that's needed to understand the exalted Christ. It contains the suffering Christ and the exalted Christ both within the crucifixion. That's why the centurion could actually look at the cross and recognize the Son of God, because suffering and abandonment is coupled with exaltation in the cross itself. Crucifixion is already transformative, and that's what the Gospel of John tells us, according to Bultmann, is that it presents the empowerment of a new self-understanding in itself, in the crucifixion itself. And this new empowerment of self-understanding is what we posit, this new historicity of man that Paul discovered, this new eschatology that is individual righteousness and individual deliverance from the sarks of the flesh in order to appropriate a true historical dialectical freedom. So it's a very much an existential progression that carries the figuration of the early Christian eschatology out beyond its contamination by Gnosticism and Stoicism. And then the axis of the true subjective self becomes a self that is disengaged with that enclosure of mythology and its false ontology. And there's a true emergence of a dialogue of responsibility as we become a new self of historicity involved in a dialectical realization of righteousness and deliverance from sarks.